Let's talk about why I believe China might be going down the tubes very, very soon. There's a couple of reasons behind my statement, obviously, and I wanted to take a few minutes of your time to talk about each of these reasons today. I mean, if we take a look at what happened in China during the past decades, I mean, we saw enormous economic growth. China has pretty much moved from poverty into middle income class, Not all people, of course, but many people. We have millions and millions of people in China that are now middle class. And of course, there's a lot of rich people in China as well. And what we can see here is that power has been shifting. It's been shifting from one hand to another. How did this happen, you may ask? And it happened because of globalism. Globalism is still taking place today, even though Western countries are now aiming to reverse all the progress that's been made over the past decades. Reverted to what it was initially. That's what they're trying to do now, because with China becoming so financially fat, we now see how China behaves. And what China does is just what every other country would do in its situation as well. And that is to expand, expand power, expand territory, assets, influence, political influence, everything. And of course, the Western Hemisphere can't be happy about that, because China's political system is so different to ours that there will always be differences. And those differences can't easily be sorted out, because one person has to give in more than the other in order for there to be some kind of an agreement, And if that doesn't happen, and of course it can't happen, then what we see is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot of changes happening in the trade world, Certain countries, taking less goods from China. And I think if this trend continues, let's say Western countries get back to manufacturing themselves, let's say they're opening up factories again, they're hiring their own people again, naturally there will be less demand for products from China, even if they're cheaper. And I think we're in a situation now where that actually needs to happen, because the influence that China has already achieved is far beyond what's acceptable in the West. And if this isn't stopped anytime soon, I think our world will be in big trouble. It will be drastically different to what it is today, to what you see today. And of course, that is not a possibility for Western countries, Western governments. They don't want that. I see a slow death happening here. I see just how countries are reverting to the old ways of doing things. Deglobalization is the new agenda. And I really believe that China will have problems in the coming years and decades. Of course, Western countries will also have problems in the coming decades. No question about that, because in order for you to gain something, there has to be sacrifice. And it's not going to happen in a week or two. It's going to take years and often even decades, before this change is reverted. What will happen to China if China loses economic power? Because the money that China earned over the past decades has been used for military expansion, has been used for infrastructure. It's been used in many ways that any other country would have used it as well. If you go to cities in China today, you see the most developed cities, the nicest cities that you have seen anywhere. And of course, that's great, that's applaudable, and that's the modernized world that people want to see. But at the end of the day, I think Western countries will revert more or less sooner rather than later, because there's no other option. There's no other option. I mean, Western countries are getting poorer in many ways, because he who has the manufacturing, he who has the goods and services, is the person who has the power, right? And China also stocked up big time on commodities. Let's just say that all the manufacturing in China is coming to an end. Of course, that's a very bold statement. It's a very unlikely scenario, because even if Western countries stop purchasing goods from China, there's still going to be other countries. There's still going to be countries in Asia. There's still going to be countries maybe in Latin America and Africa that will use Chinese products. And that's unavoidable, because, you can never control the whole population, the whole planet. But let's say most of the money that China earns right now is not available. They won't earn as much anymore in the next coming years. There's going to be a problem in China, because for an economy to strive, there has to be growth. And there can only be growth if there is more manufacturing, if there's more goods and services produced and rendered. That's the only way. And if that changes, if that comes to a halt, or if that even declines a lot, then I think the Chinese Communist Party will have a big problem. The only reason why the Communist Party of China is successful is because they can now prove that they can actually provide work to the people and that they can raise the living standards of people. Now, if that was to collapse, that would change everything. Like the people in China, Chinese citizens, they would lose trust in their own government, in their own political system. If they become poorer, and poorer and poorer, sooner rather than later, they will start complaining. And we have already seen such an outcome in China, in the past century. It happens all the time in different regions of this world. Let's talk a little bit about the zero COVID policy and how it actually affects people wanting to get out and into China. Now, the zero COVID policy is still in place in certain places in China. There's obviously a reason behind that, because most countries have actually moved away from their zero COVID policies because, first of all, people have been vaccinated, right? And the new variants are less severe, less people are hospitalized. So of course, you would think it makes sense to remove certain restrictions. Most countries have done it. Some countries have not done it. And those countries include China. There's also some other countries that still stick to it, more or less, but mainly China. What we can see here is that China is looking for control. China likes being repressive, and China forbids its own citizens to leave the country because they don't want the rich people of China to leave the country. They want to keep the rich people in the country. They don't want to see too much money move out of China because that's not good for China. They want to keep the money that has been earned in China in China. They want that money to be spent in China. They want that money to be taxed in China. And the people who got out, the rich people who got out of China, they already got out years ago. But there's a lot of people now. Some people have even been silenced, like the founder from Alibaba. He's been silenced for some of the statements he made, publicly about the Chinese government, what he thinks should change, how the government could improve things. And of course, the government does not like that. Even if a guy like Jack Ma talks about it, they don't like that. They want to have control. That's what communism is all about. Communism is all about silencing opposition. It's all about repressiveness. It's all about maintaining control. And that's what China has succeeded at very clearly. Another problem that I see is the rapid expansion of China. And we see that, of course, in the South China Sea. We've seen the island building. We have seen China get into really crazy, obscure countries, even in Africa, just to get out minerals, to export resources. But of course, China also gives back. China gives those countries what they want, and what they want is money. And that money oftentimes comes in the form of infrastructure, money comes in the form of jobs. And of course, if you were a third-grade country, of course, you would appreciate such an upgrade because you can't make it happen on your own. Western countries have failed because Western countries had the opportunity to go into certain Latin, African, South Pacific countries. They had the option to go into those countries and make some positive changes, but the West refused to do so. China was much smarter. China went ahead and invested in those countries. They, for instance, get a 99-year lease on land, on a port, and in return they lend money to those countries, and what's happening all the time is that those countries just cannot pay back the loans because the interest rate is too much. They don't have enough incoming, so they cannot pay back the money on time, or they can't pay the money back at all, whatever it is. And of course, China keeps the port, they keep the land, and they use it for very intelligent things, such as naval bases, such as manufacturing, right? So they have something going on, I think. And it's interesting, and I think that right now what we see in the Solomon Islands, which is very close to Australia, we see a clear failure in Australia's foreign policy because the Solomon Islands are Australia's neighbor. And Australia should have gone into those islands a long time ago and built a better relationship. Why hasn't Australia done that? Mind-boggling. And now Australia is complaining about China going in there and potentially building a naval base right next door in their backyard. It's crazy. But again, that's something that could have been avoided, hasn't been avoided, and now Australians are complaining about it. Obviously, the tensions that we're seeing around Taiwan are serious. It doesn't seem like China is backing off at all. Neither is the West. You know, it's getting closer and closer to an international conflict, which of course nobody wants to see. But that's the problem when a current global power does not want to reduce its power, does not want to give in, and an aspiring global power, I mean, China is not really an aspiring global power. China is already a super global power. But if nobody is willing to give in, if nobody is willing to sit down, things will eventually get bad. To finish up this video, I wanted to talk with you about some of the biggest genocides that happened over the past century. You know, over the past, whatever, 100, 120 years. Just, you know, you can take this information in, view it as you want, and form your own opinion. So basically, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, from 1976 to 1980, the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.7 and 2 million Cambodians. So this was horrific, a horrific time for Cambodia, because Cambodia did not have a very large population and still doesn't have a very large population. But the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.7 million and 2 million Cambodians. Terrible. But the Holocaust, okay, that was worse, okay, which was during Adolf Hitler's regime. And during the Holocaust of 1939 and 1945, so between a 6-year period, 6 million people were killed. Terrible, right? But the worst genocides that we have seen over the past century, you know, were actually genocides that happened in Russia and China. People don't talk about it. Stalin's communist regime from 1929 to 1953. An estimated 23 to 50 million lives were taken. Okay, that was the communist regime of Stalin. Putin thinks Stalin is a great guy. He was a great guy. Really? Do you really think so? I don't think so. But the worst genocide of all actually happened in China. Mao Zedong's regime from 1949 through 1976. It's a pretty long period, actually, 27 years to be exact. And it's estimated that Mao Zedong, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Mao Zedong terminated anywhere between 40 million and 70 million people. Absolutely crazy. Now, some of those people were Tibetans. Okay, we know Tibet, very beautiful region, one of the most beautiful regions of this wonderful planet. China went in there and destroyed historic monuments. They destroyed the culture of the people of Tibet. And they killed many Tibetans, many, and have never been charged for it. Do you think China is going down the tubes? What is the future of China? Leave a comment below and let us know. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm uploading new videos on digital nomad locations, travel updates, and investment advice several times a week right now. And if you got some more time left, check out these videos.